The commies are taking Tankie back.
Tankie. The term originates within the Communist Party of Great Britain, which should tell you right away that it's a term used by ineffective leftists who've never actually held power, but still want to look down on the socialists and communists who weren't afraid to use authority to take political and economic power from the capitalists and protect it from their inevitable attempts at counter-revolution. The term was first used to refer to members of the CPGB who had supported the USSR's use of tanks to crush an uprising in Hungary in 1956. It evolved over time into an insult for people who defend any socialist state, particularly the USSR and the People's Republic of China in the modern day.
There are some reasons why leftists have ran away from the USSR, from Maoist China, from all the other communist regimes, even though at the time they were widely triumphed by the left, the radical left, by socialists. As an example of socialism in practice, they've long been disavowed because of the absolute atrocious human rights records of these, I should say, individual rights records. I mean, what is a human right in the first place? But you know, in the Soviet Union, you had massive gulags spread across the entire country where political dissidents were interned, documented brilliantly by Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, where he details how people were locked up in the middle of the night in raids for innocuous crimes such as praying with their family at home or belonging to the wrong socialist party. It was really a terrible part of Russian history. People would be disappeared. They would just not exist the next day, and you can't even ask about them because there's just such a state of terror in the entire country. Children would inform on their parents. It was so incredibly dystopian. Not to mention the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine that was greatly aggravated by Russian policy.
These days, it's usually either used to insult someone for being left-wing in general, or for defending in any way any state that the US and the rest of the West is aligned against. Of course, most right-wingers are not ashamed or embarrassed by the idea of continuing to use the word communist for name-calling, but liberals, especially those that call themselves socialists or claim socialist leanings, don't want to risk sounding like their Cold Warrior grandparents by using the term communist as an insult. So while open right-wingers will also use the word tankies on occasion, it has particularly become the new, in vogue word to use for those that still want to signify themselves as left-wing while trashing those farther to the left. This sets up a contrast between the rational, reform-oriented leftists who seek
This is some phenomenal cool jazz in the background.
nonviolent incremental change through democratic means, and the irredeemable, radical tankies who are willing to use violence to take and maintain state power instead of doing so democratically. Tankie is not identified
To take and maintain state power, to seize the means of production, aka steal all the wealth in society. And in any society without economic freedom, there's no freedom. If you can't own property, if you can't own a business, you can't own a home, you have no freedom. You're entirely dependent upon state largesse, and that's what they want. They want you to be dependent upon the state, upon the party. They want absolute power. It's really a vile, atrocious ideology.
Identical to communist in its meaning, of course, but it still has many, many similarities. Like calling someone a communist did back in the day, it is a thought-terminating cliche. Every single thing you could say that might be inconvenient to how someone views the world or an event can simply be countered by the word tankie. No actual argument in the face of the facts presented to people, no counter, just the word tankie. Tankies are crazy.
Here's an argument. Every experiment in communism has ended in abject failure.
How someone views the world or an event can simply be countered by the word tankie. No actual argument in the face of the facts presented to people, no counter, just the word tankie. Tankies are crazy, and it would be a waste of time to even listen to what they have to say.
I don't think it goes that far. I think it's very important to refute bad arguments.
The word commie, despite being meant as an insult, at the very least brought various denominations of leftists together, from democratic socialists to anarchists to Marxist-Leninists, because of the way that it would get applied to everyone regardless of their specific ideology. These days,
those are three branches of communist thought.
Even liberals like Joe Biden are constantly being accused of being a communist by Republicans. Democrats, social democrats, and even democratic socialists and anarchists need a different term to make themselves distinct from other groups of leftists whose methods they oppose, without making themselves sound too much like a Republican. The image of a tank is useful for this, as it allows Democrats and reformist groups to paint their far-left opposition as tankies and lump them right in with the warmongering Republicans and the military-industrial complex that the liberal left absolutely does not take part in because they love peace and human rights.
The Soviet Union had massive spending on weaponry, on tanks, on the military. They were spending, I think, something like 10% of GDP during the 80s. And that's one of the problems with communism, is that with the state directing production, they're not building things that people want. They're not building pickles, they're not building consumer goods. They're not building rye bread. They're building tanks. They're putting monkeys into outer space while people don't have anything to eat. That's what happens when decisions about production are put in the hands of bureaucrats instead of in the hands of consumers.
It fits right in with the usual messaging. The word tankies, given the fact that it has a connection to the support of certain socialist states in the past or present, now divides the political left even further as it splits Marxist-Leninists and Maoists, i.e. practitioners of actually existing socialism, from the likes of anarchists, democratic socialists, and left communists even further apart than they already are. Some of the latter group, particularly anarchists from what I've seen, have purposefully pushed the word tankies particularly hard because it's finally a word that clearly separates them from the red fascists who would seek to take and defend state power instead of destroying it. Of course, the problem here is obvious. Almost every single socialist movement that's ever come to power and held it for, at least a decade, has been Marxist-Leninist or Maoist.
So why is that good? Why is being in power good, as opposed to making good decisions for your people?
So if you attack Marxist-Leninists or
as opposed to having a moral philosophy, why is power for its own sake a good thing?
Maoists for expressing any kind of support for past socialist states that you regard as irredeemably evil, you are attacking the only ideological camps to the left of liberal capitalism that have ever had any success in holding power for an amount of time long enough to implement and test their theories. Given the fact that they never had any
And what were the results of these tests?
Power in the first place, democratic socialists, anarchists, and the like have the benefit of not having much negative history or baggage, i.e. legitimate mistakes or even brutal crimes paired with decades of Western anti-socialist lies. So they're often spared from the term tankies, at least.
Even anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, in their brief moment in Spain, committed unthinkable atrocities, murdering thousands of people for their political beliefs, attacking churches, enforcing the death penalty for money. So I think it's safe to say that communism as a whole is just a barbarous, monstrous ideology that is anti-human, anti-prosperity, anti-life. And it doesn't matter what flavor of communist you are.
By more left-wing liberals. Of course, there have been attempts at anarchism, like in Ukraine, Catalonia, and Manchuria, but all of them failed within a few years, and in all actuality, they were really far more Marxist-Leninist than anything else. They had governments and legislatures and armies and prisons and work camps. They just called things
Classic no true Scotsman fallacy.
different names. So armies were people's brigades, and prisons were detainment centers, or whatever word sounded better than armies or
It's never true communism.
prisons, but they served the same function. As for the Demsocs, there has never been a state that simply voted itself into socialism and then survived the inevitable siege. Capitalists both foreign and domestic would never allow it, and neither would the entrenched politicians who depend on donations from those same capitalists to fund their campaigns. Capital has far too many economic, political, and social layers of protection for it to simply be voted into submission, and those with capital would much prefer you waste your energy pursuing well-meaning but
Capital's already under submission. Capital serves the needs of the consumers. That's why we have such radically high standards of living today in Western countries, because capital serves the needs of the consumers. It serves the general public. It serves workers. Meanwhile, socialist regimes serve only the political elite.
ultimately ineffective electoral paths, rather than taking part in other, more militant forms of organizing. Even if you overcome the odds and manage to vote a socialist into power, the protectors of capital have no problem working outside the law to achieve their desired outcomes. When violence is initiated by these groups, the socialist state is left with two choices: end the violence using equal or likely greater force and therefore become tankies, or give in to their enemies' demands and relinquish their sovereignty and commitment to socialism. A great example of this
Go for path B.
is the case of Salvador Allende, a democratic socialist who was elected to serve as the president of Chile in 1970. The electoral success in 1970 came after years of struggle, a struggle made no less difficult by the fact that the CIA had identified Allende early on as a potential threat and
That's true. But electoral success, I mean, he squeaked by with the narrowest of margins, okay? In a multi-way race where he had just like a tiny plurality. I mean, he squeaked by.
had spent millions of dollars throughout the 1960s to fund his opponents and propagandize against him. When he managed to win anyway,
I don't know that millions figure. I'd be interested to look into that.
the White House and the CIA doubled down, vowing to make the economy scream in Chile to create popular resentment towards Allende's government while they pursued a two-track plan of regime change.
Yeah, they didn't need any help from Washington to make the Chilean economy sink.
Track 1 called for parliamentary trickery, while Track 2 simply called for a military coup. When Track 1 failed, Track 2 became inevitable.
Washington didn't actually have a hand in Pinochet's coup in Chile, although they welcomed it, but they didn't actually participate.
Allende's presidency ended on September the 11th, 1973, when he shot himself as the presidential palace was being surrounded and bombarded by the Chilean military, after being warned by none other than Fidel Castro that he wasn't being thorough enough in securing the power of his government. Castro turned out to be right, of course.
Allende actually tried to seize power and turn himself into a permanent dictator. His allies in Congress, the ones who elected him, the resolution passed by the Christian Democrats declared that the Allende government sought to, quote, to conquer absolute power with the obvious purpose of subjecting all citizens to the strictest political and economic controls by the state, with the goal of establishing a totalitarian system. Pinochet was actually Allende's right-hand man when he came to power, but privately he was disgusted with the measures that Allende was taking with his economic stewardship, which had brought total ruin to the Chilean people. Real wages plummeted, inflation was out of control, and then there was strikes by truckers. So when the parliament, the Chilean parliament, issued that resolution calling upon the armed forces to intervene and put an end to the Allende dictatorship, Pinochet listened to that call. He was not an ambitious person. He never sought power, but he had it thrusted upon him, and he saved his country from becoming a communist hellhole like so many other places, like the Soviet Union, like Maoist China, like Venezuela.
And Allende was ultimately forced to take his own life to avoid falling into the hands of Augusto Pinochet, and is rumored to have done so with the very same AK-47 rifle that had been a gift from Fidel. Even if you vote in socialism, you're gonna need some tanks to survive. Why? Because the people who want to kill you just for being a socialist have plenty of tanks. They have the money to build more and even research how to build better and stronger tanks in order to crush you more efficiently. They also have the means to bribe and influence your own military officers so that the tanks you do have will be turned against you, creating the exact situation that Castro had tried to warn Allende about. Just being a socialist in a global economy dominated by capitalists puts a target on your back, and the people aim—
Just being a socialist, just stealing all the land, just stealing all the factories, just stealing all the wealth that people have created over generations, just destroying economies, destroying societies, destroying lives.
Aiming at that target have most of the world's firepower and no qualms about using it. This fact is evident when assessing the history of the various states that attempted to build a socialist economy in the 20th century. Again, it makes sense. Billionaires do not just let you take their property. They pay people to make sure that you don't, and that includes having you killed if you try. So the people who hold the only ideology that so far has proved itself to be a rational and effective response to our existing material reality and the obstacles that have historically been—
Rational and effective response? Every communist regime has utterly failed. It's not rational to keep trying the same flawed plan of action and then saying, oh, it failed again, well, we'll just try again. I mean, communism does not work. It bankrupts the economy. It's not a viable economic system. You need free enterprise. You need private ownership of property. That's what works.
And faced by those seeking to establish a socialist economy are also the ones relentlessly demonized by all of the other so-called socialists as fascists in disguise. Now, this is not to say that at least some Marxist-Leninists or those who would claim to be MLs aren't basically fascists in disguise. They exist, and these are people known as the PATSOCs, or Patriotic Socialists. The PATSOCs, people like Infrared, Jackson Hinkle, and Caleb Maupin, are continuing the work of the LaRoucheite movement of the 70s and 80s. Lyndon LaRouche was a self-proclaimed Trotskyist originally, or an anti-USSR communist who then went on to work with the CIA to basically wreck leftist movements in the US, even going so far as to literally send armed men to communist marches and the like to attack others on the grounds of their not being real socialists. But it's incredibly dishonest to lump these people in with all MLs or all Maoists as being fascists in disguise, when Marxist-Leninists are constantly organizing reading circles, coordinating supply runs and mutual aid, when the majority are completely pro-LGBT+, pro-decolonization, pro-everything you should be pro if you're progressive. It's like if I pretended that libertarians were the same thing as anarcho-communists when they very obviously aren't, even though many libertarians will call themselves anarchists just because they hate the government. For a more mainstream-friendly example, it's like pretending that Joe Manchin represents the entire Democratic Party, even as he undermines bills that many of the other Democrats want to pass. He is a Democrat, but portraying him as the Democrat and representative of his party as a whole is dishonest. Ultimately, you need to assess someone's words and actions and not just their preferred ideological label. That's how you separate people like Jackson Hinkle from people like Second Thought. The Communist Party USA and the Black Panthers are both a complete destruction of the lie that Tankies, or people that support socialist states and emulate the parties that formed them, aren't real socialists or don't care about socialist action and actually improving people's material conditions. The CPUSA, from the 30s to the 50s, was the pro-USSR wing of socialist politics in America, and though its influence has been largely erased from history, and while it had many other issues, it was also by far the most influential and radical group for its time, helping to form numerous labor organizations and unions, and perhaps most famously playing an important role.
Unions. I hate unions. Unions accomplish nothing. Wages are determined by productivity. All unions do is slow things down. They function like gunk in the machinery of the economy, just slowing things down, making things less dynamic. Unions wholly unnecessary.
Role in the defending of the Scottsboro Nine. In the 60s and 70s, after the CPUSA was gutted by the Red Scare, the most radical organization became the Black Panthers, which were Maoist and
Black Panthers were pretty based
Marxist-Leninist, and their leaders like Huey Newton and Fred Hampton openly proclaimed their support for the likes of Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong. They were, by any modern definition of the word, tankies, and just like them, modern tankies are also extremely involved in their communities, distributing mutual aid, in protesting, and so on. Whatever flaws they may have, it is a lie, a disgusting, delusional, easily disproved lie that all MLs are online LARPers that don't care about change in the real world. It is a carefully crafted lie meant to dissuade anyone from getting involved in radical action beyond the Democratic Party, because it makes people think anyone farther to the left than the Democratic Party is just a weirdo red fascist genocide.
I think he's got a solid point here that you need to engage in real life political action. You need to take to the streets, you need to organize.
I'd love her. The problem, of course, is that for too many people, it isn't about the evidence, about what actually helps people. It's not about realizing that the truth might be a bit more complex than what you learned from your history textbook. It's about, particularly to the people that stand to gain from it, believing that the fascist LaRouchites and PatSocs represent Marxism-Leninism and Maoism as a whole because it confirms what they already believe about Marxism, and then they can ignore any evidence to the contrary. It's not even a unique behavior. It's the same mechanic that a Democrat will use to categorize all Republicans as trashy, racist, country bumpkins, or a Republican will use to describe all Democrats as blue-haired radical feminists. Stereotypes make for easy opponents compared to the diversity of opposition we face in reality. Of course, the designation of red fascist is particularly ironic when you look at how liberals and social democrats have, throughout history, ended up allying with fascism to stop socialism, specifically in the years between the two world wars. This happened in the Social Democratic Party of Germany in 1919, this happened under the Italian Social Democratic Party in Italy, as well as under the Shakai Taishuto Party in Japan. It happens every day when liberals and social democrats say they would vote for communists or socialists over Democrats if they had any chance of winning, which, okay, but then also don't even do anything politically outside of voting and hoping for the best. Tony Blair, Eugene Lyons, Eldridge Cleaver, Bayard Rustin, Claude McKay, Jay Lovestone, Irving Kristol, Margaret Buber Newman, and Milovan Djilas are all examples of the supposed principled anti-communist communist. All of them later in life went on to become right-wingers or, at best, right-leaning liberals. Djilas, after a lifetime making a career out of being a principled communist against Yugoslavia, said near the end of his life that, in fact, communism doesn't work at all. I won't say that there aren't genuine or intelligent Trotskyists out there, but at the same time, prominent Trotskyists like Max Chapman, Max Eastman, Sidney Hook, and Christopher Hitchens all ended up becoming right-wingers or at least anti-communists later in life as well.
The Trotskyist to neoconservative pipeline was real.
Father and godfather of neoconservatism, James Burnham and Irving Kristol, respectively, were both once Trotskyists. Not to mention, again, Lyndon fucking LaRouche. The list goes on and on and on of these people. Fascinating how the only socialists that have ever had any actual real-world influence and state power are by far the most demonized and attacked group by other so-called leftists, while the fact that so many of these supposed principled anti-USSR leftists.
Should I just not going to go into the record of these communist regimes at all? I mean, talk about ignoring the elephant in the room.
Always end up becoming right-wingers of various stripes is seemingly never mentioned at all. I wonder if there's some sort of pattern to this. Of course, some people aren't necessarily for or against the USSR at all, but simply say, what is the point in bothering over it in the first place? It doesn't even exist anymore. And that's perfectly fair. Defending socialist states is not the most important part of building socialism. Actual leftist action on the ground, organizing communities, and making real-life plans is. But defending socialist states is also leftist action and is also important. Why? Because the demonization of socialist states is fundamentally intertwined with the demonization of socialism at large. It is the ever-present warning sign. This is what socialism leads to. And a rhetorical cudgel that works just as well on SocDems and DemSocs as it does on Marxist-Leninists. After all, what does the average person think of when they think of socialism, more than anything? They think of monsters like Stalin and Mao, evil, vicious murderers who ruled with an iron fist over a totalitarian police state.
Gulag, secret police, inability to get basic consumer goods, ultimately crumbling economic system.
Regardless of how accurate of a portrayal this is, it's just not
super accurate.
An effective strategy to instantly give in to that framing. To just say, you're right, the USSR was a terrible fascist dystopia, but that wasn't real socialism, or this or that, but this time, socialism is gonna be good. Some people might believe you, but a lot of people are just going to say you're just making excuses, or something along those lines, and you become very easy to dismiss. And even for people who are amenable to socialism, who still believe it can happen, simply believing the USSR was a dystopia on par with a fascist police state will still give them a lot of hesitancy at the same time. Why even try to have a revolution if there's a chance it might end up like the USSR? Why not try reform instead if it's less risky? After all, no well-adjusted person wants other people to get hurt, and in the immortal words of Chairman Mao, revolution is not a dinner party. These are all doubts that capitalists want to be raised. Bonus points for ignoring the fact that our current status quo under capitalism is already incredibly violent, and the point of the proposed revolution is to put an end to that violence as soon.
Capitalism isn't violent. Capitalism as an economic system is wholly consensual, predicated upon mutually beneficial exchange. To the degree that there is violence in the system, it's because of the state. These are separate things, capitalism and the modern state. These are not one and the same. But there's no violence in capitalism. I go to the store, I buy a good, they sell me the good. There's no violence there, just mutually beneficial exchange. My employer hires me, He wants my labor, I want his money, we both win. That's the beautiful thing about capitalism, is it's all mutually beneficial exchanges, just win-win transactions.
As soon as possible. The correct belief, according to capitalists, is that the current status quo is both peaceful and just, and a revolution would be introducing violence where previously there had been.
I wouldn't say the status quo is entirely peaceful and just, because you do have the state. The state is the organization of the political means. It is the massive, widespread, systematic robbery of the economic class for the benefit of the political class. So there is certainly some need for reform in our present system, but we don't want to blow up the state. I mean, we don't want to give the state more power. We want to take power away from the state. Communists want to give all the power to the state, which is just incredibly naive and dangerous. I mean, it's never worked. Any society where the state has all the power, that's Nazi Germany. That's Italian under Mussolini, fascism. That's the Soviet Union. What you want is to really confine the power of the state, to shrink it, to eliminate it altogether. The state is a fundamentally immoral organization, but capitalism is great. Capitalism is just people trading, okay? This is the basis of the flourishing of human civilization. Trade and exchange, private property, private ownership of property.
None. What many people don't realize is that propaganda that demonizes socialist states, both past and present, is fundamental to propaganda that demonizes socialism as a whole. Anti-communist ideology is deeply...
You don't need propaganda to demonize communism. History demonizes communism because communism's a demon.
Rooted in and intertwined with anti-Soviet ideology. They support one another. They uphold one another. They make each other stronger. So by giving in to anti-Soviet ideology, you are giving in to anti-communist ideology, and you are dividing leftism even more than it already is. There's a reason the CIA poured endless millions of dollars and Nazi propagandists into crafting their anti-communist messaging through Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Free Asia. There's a reason anti-communist leftists like George Orwell, Boris Pasternak, Leon Trotsky, and Arthur Koestler have all had their works distributed or reprinted by the CIA. Boris Pasternak's work being given the Nobel Prize was pretty directly thanks to the CIA's own promotion. Arthur Koestler's work was heavily distributed by the IRD and the CIA. George Orwell's Animal Farm was turned into a world-famous film by the CIA. There's a reason Robert
4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
Conquest was paid by a right-wing Ukrainian lobbying group to write the Holodomor genocide narrative into popular culture. There's a reason the Hoover Institute, which is funded by numerous conservative think tanks, itself funds anti-communist academic history. There's a reason the Memorial Institute, which is funded by the
So is he denying the Holodomor?
likes of the Boris Yeltsin Foundation, Boris Yeltsin being one of the main actors who led to the dissolution of the USSR, and the CIA-funded Radio Liberty participates in anti-USSR activism to this day, even though the Soviet Union is long gone. There's a reason the CIA-funded anti-USSR communist journals like the Partisan Review or Encounter magazine through left-wing anti-USSR communist art movements like the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
God, leftists are so whiny.
Specific left-com literature and art was promoted so heavily because of this same fact. Because of how much...
They're all like, oh, the Comintern, oh, the Comintern, oh, the government was spying on us. Shut up.
More convincing anti-Sovietism would be coming from other supposed leftists instead of just being obvious right-wing propaganda.
And neutralize them.
Intentions of anti-USSR leftists like Pasternak and Orwell may or may not have been to create a fundamental world culture of not just anti-Sovietism, but anti-communism. But that is, regardless, exact.
Or maybe, just hear me out here, maybe these were avowed socialists that looked at the horrors of the Soviet Union and said, wait a second, we don't want to do that. yes, we care about egalitarianism and the poor and all that shit, but we don't want a totalitarian government that throws people in jail because they say the wrong thing. You know, maybe that was part of their thought process.
Exactly what their work has done. When you spread anti-socialist state myths, you may think, whether you believe that particular myth or not, that you're simply serving to make socialism seem more palatable to people turned off by the likes of Stalin or Mao. But what you're actually doing is simply playing right into the hands of the capitalists and the fascists.
Myths? What myths? Address the claims.
By continuing to perpetuate exaggerated or outright dishonest myths about the most significant socialist states that have ever existed. After all, the purposeful intention of opponents of socialism is not to disavow
What myths? Get into the specifics.
states like the USSR because they weren't truly socialist or because they betrayed socialist ideals, but because they tried to be socialist at all. As such, they seek to sow doubt in the minds of anyone who might ever want a different system than capitalism, those to whom socialism might even look good on paper. Anti-socialist state narratives directly serve the interests of capital by demonizing the one political movement that has ever remotely posed an existential threat to capitalism by offering a promising replacement.
Nationalization of heavy industry poses an existential threat to society. The state cannot plan the economy. You need the market. The market is the only means of rationally allocating scarce resources on a global scale
That can actually defend itself. In spreading these narratives, these uncritical demonizations, you are, whether you mean to or not, directly
Big business is responsible for the high standards of living we enjoy today.
serving capitalism. Ultimately, it's an important task to shift the understanding of states like the USSR from the idea of it being an outright disaster to the reality, which is that it was a flawed but impressive experiment that accomplished a great deal against incredible odds.
It really didn't. You had gulags. You had famines that were aggravated by state policy at the same time that people were starving to death in Ukraine. They were exporting food. Look at the conditions in Soviet hospitals. They were terrible. They had no anesthesia, except in the party hospitals. The hospitals for the Politburo members were very nice. So even on that grounds, the communist experiment in the USSR, it was not some egalitarian society. You still had the elites at the top and everybody else at the bottom. But in this society, the elites weren't there because they produced a lot of wealth and made a lot of trades and served society like billionaires like Bezos or Bill Gates did. They were there because they were high-ranking party officials, because they had political power, and because they used that political power to expropriate the production of the workers. I mean, communists are all the time going on about surplus value and how employee relationships are exploitative, yet this guy in the Soviet Union that he's championing, I mean, you had that exact same relationship between, the party officials, the Politburo, the high-ranking members of the party, and everybody else. It was very difficult to get an apartment, and if you did get one, it was crummy. It was just such a terrible system. Why would you defend this?
The USSR had many, many flaws, errors, and
many flaws
and shortcomings, but it is
and they killed millions of people for their political beliefs. It was a slave state.
is a fact that no other country with anywhere near the USSR's levels of political and economic power ever, relatively, did so much material good in comparison to its competitors at the time.
Material good for what? That's the whole point. They could produce a large military. They could concentrate all the wealth in the hands of the state, and the state could do a few things, you know. But that's not doing good. That's the opposite of good. It's good when consumers leave rich and full lives, when they have, you know, food and clothing and stuff like that. You know, high quality. That's what society is all about. People enjoying a high standard of living. It's not about throwing some chimpanzee into space while everybody's starving or eating cash at 3 meals a day.
No other country lifted itself from a third world backwater to a world superpower in such little time. And
If you judge by the standards of living of the Russian people, they were never a superpower, not even close. There have been many countries that have seen much more impressive rises in standard of living, such as the Asian tigers, you know, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan. Botswana is another example. Of course, the USA back in the day. The USSR was always a paper tiger. Sure, in GDP statistics it looked impressive, because GDP doesn't actually measure the wealth of a nation, at least not accurately, especially in a communist system. They had something called the Polish disease. Basically, they would have these production quotas that they had to meet, and if people didn't meet them, they got punished. If they met them, they got rewarded. So, people were producing to the quota. They would use as many inputs as possible to get as much output as possible. Didn't really matter about the quality. Didn't really matter if there was a need for it. The books were always cooked because it was very important for the managers to meet their quotas. That's what they were judged on. Most of the output was just not even useful. Very low quality. Just like in Maoist China, when Mao told all the peasants to stop growing food and instead start smelting iron in your backyard, they ended up with a massive famine and a whole bunch of shitty pig iron that was no use for anybody.
and in the process improved the living conditions for countless millions at a pace that the world had never seen.
Complete lie. Actually, the final years of Tsarist Russia were fairly liberal. They had full freedom of the press, no censorship, even Bolshevik papers and books were freely printed, full freedom of foreign travel, independent trade unions, independent courts, trial by jury, fairly advanced system of social legislation, a parliament. Meanwhile, between 1913 and 1970, according to the research of Sergei Propokovich, Noam Jasny, and Janet Chapman, real wages hardly grew between 1913 and 1970 in the Soviet Union, a shocking period of stagnation. Swiss economist Jovan Pavlevsky calculated in 1969 that the real wages of Soviet industrial workers attained the level of 1913 only in 1963. You know, five decades of stagnation and decline. Soviet citizens had to endure the daily misery of lack of meat and vegetables, washing powder, razor blades. There were constant shortages of these things. It's like the classic joke, two babushkas are standing in line waiting for bread. It's 2 hours. There's still, a long line ahead of them. The one says, "Oh, isn't it awful? We're standing here waiting 5 hours, 6 hours, all day for a loaf of moldy bread." And the second babushka says, "Yeah, but it could be a lot worse. In America, they don't even have bread lines." And things were even worse in the Soviet satellite states. According to Ilya Zemstov, writing in 1976, 1 in 2 retired persons in the Soviet Union lived in poverty. And in the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, 75% of the population lived below the poverty line. There were more homes without water, electricity, and toilets than in the whole of Western Europe. That's in Azerbaijan. About half the housing in the Soviet Union was without running water or sewage. Again, this was in the 70s. And the massive collectivized agriculture sector of the Soviet Union was incredibly inefficient. There was a reform made, and Soviet collective farmers were allowed to have some tiny plots, private plots, that they could tend to and earn profits from after their shifts are done in the collective agriculture. Despite representing only 3% of the total agriculture area of the Soviet Union, these private holdings provided 1/3 of the country's total agricultural output. Just proving, what we already know, which is that when people have private property, it's much more productive than communal property because you're going to benefit from that private property. So you have a huge incentive to take care of it, to chase off any pests, to make sure everything, to put in all the time and make sure everything's just so you can grow those turnips or those radishes, those beets, and make some nice borscht soup.
Country than China has accomplished such rapid development and modernization since. No other country liberated women to such a great extent in so little time for its time. No other country for its time in history put in more effort to provide for its people in terms of healthcare, a workday of reasonable length, the promotion of minority culture.
I mean, that's just all completely false. He's just completely lying. It must be delusional. So the health of the Soviet Union citizens was absolutely abysmal. According to B. Iskakov of the Moscow Institute of National Economy, this was in 1990, 53 and 60, between 53 and 63% of the population belong to people with hidden deficiencies, people who are chronically ill but can wholly or partially function, and people who cannot function because of grave physical deficiencies. 70 to 80 million people are chronically ill and have serious physical and mental deficiencies, and in Moscow alone, up to 68% of the population is health deficient. And this is because of a lack of proper medical care and malnutrition. 3/4 of the USSR's 170 million children have been officially classified as unhealthy. 1/4 of them are chronically ill or handicapped. Between 25 and 25% of these are mentally retarded. Why? It's a complex of factors: poor diets, pollution, low quality of healthcare, stress, illegal drugs, legal drugs, and STDs. Alcoholism, of course, and fetal alcohol syndrome played a large part. So looking at the healthcare system of the Soviet Union, it was basically impossible for ordinary people to get decent pharmaceuticals. Drugstores would have only the most primitive medicines. Moreover, the doctors did not give prescriptions based on medical need, but on the availability of drugs. They used massive overuse of penicillin, which led to antibiotic resistance accumulated in the population. This is the only drug they had. All of the hospitals were extremely congested. In Moscow, hospitals kept 4 to 6 patients per room. In more foreign places, far off places, hospitals would house 12 to 16 patients per room. Private rooms were very rare. Of course, all the medical care was supposed to be free, but there were enormous lines for such things as preventative checkups and surgery. Rationing is a common feature of socialized medicine. People with chronic appendicitis would wait 1.5 years for service. Cancer detection was very poor. There was no screening for the masses, only for the political elite, so by the time it was detected, it was too late. Rural areas had virtually no real medical care. There were no disposable syringes in rural hospitals, so they would be reused on average 1,000 times, sterilized by boiling. Boiling syringes actually works if you do it for 40 minutes, but they didn't always have that time. So there was an epidemic of hepatitis. 716,000 cases were reported in 1988, over 30 times the number of cases reported in the U.S. There's a lot of AIDS victims in the Soviet Union. A lot were given the disease through government dirty needles or the AIDS-infected public blood supply. Physicians were extremely low paid. Despite 7 years of schooling, they made a third of a salary of a bus driver. But there were some perks because they had a lot of access to resellable goods and bribes. They also had the highest rate of abortions in the world. 106 per 1,000 fertile females.
Liberation of trans and gay people. No other country supported so many numerous liberation movements across the Third World to help emancipate countless people from their colonial oppressors. No other country, basically as a virtue of merely existing, helped usher in the foundation of social democracy in Europe, which was promoted in Europe as a way to help avoid violent revolution. But instead, people will just say, yes, the USSR was a complete failure, and it's easy enough for Americans to accept that uncritically because the Soviet Union isn't around anymore, and we've only ever heard about how evil it was and how awesome it was when we defeated them with capitalism and freedom. The USSR was a disastrous dystopia, and there is nothing to learn from it or respect about it.
Oh, there's something to learn from it. Do not do this again.
Bullshit. Whether you like it or not, regardless of its mistakes, the USSR always will be a symbol of hope and an inspiration to millions, if not billions, of people, especially in the third.
Hope for what? Hope that someday you too can live under a repressive, totalitarian regime that has complete control over society? What sort of delusional bullshit is this?
World, where the USSR assisted many anti-colonial movements and offered an alternative to US and Western hegemony, as well as in the USSR itself, where people had pensions and free healthcare and education and housing. There are many
What a joke.
things that can be learned from both the successes and failures.
This guy is such... This is so stupid.